When people in the climate space talk about this amorphous scope 3, it's something they assume and top down. So going down into that supply chain and really developing software and solutions that work for manufacturers was how we went and came up with Pathways.
Welcome to another Climate Tech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. Leise Sandeman is co-founder of Pathways, a company using data to make heavy manufacturing more sustainable. She's passionate about things as disparate as steel production, AI, and biodiversity, which is probably a great combination of interests for a climate tech founder. I reached Leise in Copenhagen. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Leise, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're the co-founder of a company called Pathways, which aims to decarbonize the manufacturing process. And right now, at least, you're focused on building materials. Where did the idea for Pathways come from?
I always love that question because, there's this conception that you wake up one morning and you've had this brilliant idea for a solution that everyone urgently needs. Me and my co-founder Alex likes to say that the idea from Pathways really came from our customers. But there's, of course, more pieces to it. So a few different pieces of the puzzles here. We'd spend a lot of time speaking with real estate developers, architects, and general contractors. And they kept saying, we're missing data. We can't figure out the data of the buildings when we build them and how to decarbonize them. And I'm simple, and I'm from Denmark. So I think of buildings like Lego, right? They're the sum of the bricks. And when you went down and looked at the bricks, it became really clear that manufacturers were struggling to deliver the product carbon footprint, or in the kind of terminology, environmental product declarations and life cycle assessments. And that pressure and demand was really it. The second part was I spent a while working out in India with Tata Steel. And, you stand in Jamshedpur and all you can see is steel. The size and gravity of the challenge became really clear. But what also became clear was that manufacturers were largely left alone without any tools or software and help on how to actually understand their own supply chain. They're really everyone else's scope 3. But when people in the climate space talk about this amorphous scope 3, it's something they assume and top down. So going down into that supply chain and really developing software and solutions that work for manufacturers was how we went and came up with Pathways.
I love that because as an investor myself, I have a bias towards companies that, work with their customers first and say, like, there's really a problem here, and they build a solution, a product to serve those customers and solve that problem, versus the other kind of like more, I guess, top-down approach of like, I have a really cool idea. Let's just build this thing and see if anyone wants it. The kind of like field of dreams, if you build it, they will come. That often doesn't work in entrepreneurship, but finding something where you're embedded in the space. And like, as you say, steel's a very good example. And you see this and you understand kind of the wickedness of the problem in the view of the companies that, that have it. And then you come up with ideas for how to solve that.
No, you're absolutely right. And the same goes for, it's a continuous journey. You don't just come up with your product, right? It's investors talk about the infamous product market fit, right? Do you have the right product? Does it fit what your customers ultimately want? And is there scale in it? And we talk a lot about that as kind of, you have your hand on something that's hot and you got to continue following that, right? So as soon as you have a few customers that asking for something else, testing and developing that, is that working? How can that deliver value? It's really a continuous journey, much more than you woke up one day and you had an idea and then it was done.
Yeah, product market fit is a really moving target, right? The problem changes. The features that you came out with 5 years ago are commoditized now, and you have to kind of keep ahead of the curve.
It's like going to the gym. It's an everyday activity.
Well, I don't know if I... I agree with that in principle. But set some of the numbers here. So what do we need to know kind of about the environmental impact of construction materials? And you mentioned steel, which I would imagine has a massive footprint.
Yeah. Let's start with what we call the built environment, right? This is the most shocking fact in my mind. The next 30 years, we're going to build more globally than we ever have in human history. Every month, we're building the equivalent of a new New York City. Americans love that fact. And everyone deserves good and safe housing. Goes without saying, right? And particularly as we're seeing rapid climate change, adaptation and need for protection and changes in how we build our infrastructure is also increasing. And all that is corresponding to a huge demand on building materials. So globally right now, the built environment is responsible for 40% of emissions. And a lot of attention has been put on, heating and electrification. But 11% globally of emissions, that's just greenhouse gas, that's not even talking about waste and biodiversity, is just pure materials. And this bucket is looking to increase rather than decrease. And right now we have very few solutions. And so, when we think about the numbers here, this is an area that's not going to be helped very much by electrifications and the innovations we're seeing in the energy space. It's also incredibly dispersed globally, which means there's very few silver bullets. I like to say it's a game of slivers of silver. And that's really why, we think it's so important to sit with every single product and improve, whether we're working with a customer that has an innovative product and they want to show how much better it is, or with an established corporate that's looking to reduce 1 or 2%, because that really shifts the needle.
So, and who are those customers? Maybe you can walk us through a little bit the kind of what the platform looks like. And are the customers both these corporates that are looking to reduce their footprint and the manufacturers of materials? Is it in that sense kind of like a platform, or is one or the other more the customer?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask anyone listening to this podcast right now to kind of close their eyes and stick out their head.
Unless they're driving.
Unless they're driving. If they're driving, you're not allowed to close your eyes. In which fact, actually keep your eyes open, but look around, right? The window where you're sitting, the steel beam in the house you're in, the bricks, the carpet, anyone who produces any of those materials, that's our potential customer, right? So our customers are companies that have production sites, have plants who actually make something. That's a whole host of different types of companies, spanning from big companies that make cement and ready-mix concrete, steel manufacturers, utility poles, complex wood panels, carpets, down to kind of what I'll call less of our core customer type, but customers we like to work with, which are other innovative companies that are making innovations in the space. But the majority of our customers are large companies that are looking to understand the product footprint across a portfolio of maybe 1,000 products or 10,000 different SKUs.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. So basically, you're collecting and processing data, you're generating lifecycle analyses, which are also known as LCAs, for the materials from this data. And then you're kind of condensing that into something called an environmental product declaration, or EPD, which is a new term for me, actually. And it's sort of like a verification document that's the summary of the LCA. And then is this kind of the end product of what comes out of it? And yeah, answer that first, and then I've got some follow-up questions on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Pathways sits as a platform that our customers get access to that shows close to real-time view of emission for each product. So we think of the life cycle assessment like the engine. What do you need to create a life cycle assessment of that steel beam that's in your house? You need to figure out, well, what was all of the input materials? How was it transported to the manufacturing site? And what's everything that goes into the manufacturing process? In life cycle assessment terminology, A1, A2, A3. All that data sits in a host of different data systems out with our customers. The most typical ones we integrate with are ERP systems, procurement information, operating systems. And what we've become really good at Pathways is basically pulling that data without our customers needing to do a lot of mastering or a lot of data handling, because we know how to transform those inputs into the life cycle assessments. I had a call with a facility manager the other day where we were walking through our platform. And as he was engaging and looking with it, he said, "Oh, this just looks like an overview of my production flow diagram." And I said, that's exactly what a life cycle assessment is. It's an environmental digital mirror of your production process. And that's really what our customers are able to then play with.
Digital twin, it's also known as, right?
Exactly. Digital twin is kind of like the amorphous term that's been going around for decades, right? With the dream of how do we truly mirror the production process. But I think we're doing some of the closest that exist in the market to that, which is being able to dive into a specific input of a product, or a specific production process.
And I can imagine this works really well, but if the data is good, right? It's totally dependent on the data and then the kind of analysis and synthesis of that data into something that goes out. Where does the data come from? Is it self-reported, or how do you ensure that it's good data in?
Yeah, so what was kind of our big unlock in a lot of this? Well, life cycle assessments in themselves are not that complex. They're certainly not rocket science. It's amount of something times intensity of it.
Mm-hmm.
What we found out is that, finding the intensity factors of, for example, an electricity grid is not that complex. What's really hard for customers is actually finding their own data. How much electricity did we use in this production line? Or how much water or how much waste was generated? Or which supplier and how much are we using in each production line? But this is data that they keep, right? They are either keeping it for production tracking, for efficiency reasons, or for just kind of receivable rate on the procurement side. So our whole thesis is don't have customers put in data again or double down on data. This data exists in their systems, and it's all about figuring out where it lives, building the API roads, and then we can pull out that data. That doesn't mean it's perfect, right? We get some really, really messy data, but that's kind of, when we deploy AI on our side, it's a lot about structuring and sorting the messy data on our customer side.
Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, and that kind of principle. I can imagine that a lot of the customers you're working with have been historically working with consultants to try to surface this kind of stuff and working kind of in a more manual process. Is that kind of the process that you're automating, and does it still require kind of a lot of, consultative hand-holding at the setup phase? Transform all your company's milestones, big or small, into impact with Impact Hero. Whether it's a sale, a new hire, a demo booked, or anything else, with Impact Hero, you automatically generate a gift that matters, like a tree planted, a kilo of plastic recovered, or a piece of coral reef restored. Join the hundreds of companies that are already boosting sales and retention while making an impact. Go to impacthero.com/podcast now to get 10% off. Again, that's impacthero.com/podcast to get 10% off.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, yes. I mean, in some ways, Pathways is a really simple business. We're taking something that was done all manually, paying very high prices for consultants externally for good reason, because they're spending, tens of hundreds of hours on this. Back and forth, sending Excels. Can you fill out this document? Oh, you got the wrong data in here. Oh, this number doesn't make sense. I mean, the average wait time with working with a consultant to generate an environmental product declaration can easily be kind of 12, 18 months. Mostly because you're going in and you're finding all this data manually and you're having to put it into a template and back and forth and building the LCA. So that is the process we are automating. What are the biggest differences when we think about onboarding a customer versus working with a consultant? Well, we think of it as it's all about data, which means you don't get around in some way, shape, or form involving IT. And that introduces a setup phase, right? I was speaking with one of our lead engineers, asking him, well, how long time does it take to build the API to this specific customer? He said, roughly 2.5 minutes. And I said, well, I can't tell that to the customer because, it seems completely unreasonable. The short answer here, though, is the technology part is not very complex. It's getting the right person from IT on a call, making sure they also have the context and having them give the API key so we can pull the data. The tech side of pulling data from our customer is not difficult, but there's always a people component.
You mentioned AI. I've been doing this podcast for a little over a year, and at the beginning, AI would kind of pop up occasionally, and now I feel like it's in every episode. And it has to be because it's so core to a lot of the things that we're doing. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, I don't know, your philosophy, your approach to using AI, maybe even some of the kind of nuts and bolts of it. Are you like adapting large language models for your specific internal uses? In what ways are you using AI to build a bigger moat around you relative to competitors?
I think the first thing here is our customers do not care if we use AI. They care about if we're solving their problem. And from that perspective, AI I believe it's truly transformative to how our whole industry is working, to how you build technology companies and how you scale solutions. But that's not how our customers are thinking about or why they're thinking about buying Pathways, which means when we apply, we applied a few different places right now in our solution stack. The most important place is not Gen AI coming up with new data. It's training models on all the context of data that a customer might share. So we have a customer in French-speaking Canada. A lot of their fuel information are in French PDFs. And LLMs are great at actually reading out all of that context and pulling out, well, what was the fuel consumption use and summarizing that out. Right? That's a fantastic use. It's kind of cutting down something that would have taken 20, 30 hours of manual work, now done in seconds. And the other part here is, every manufacturer thinks of their process as really unique, but the data looks super similar. Everyone has input materials. Everyone uses a combination of electricity, fuels, lubricants, water, waste, generation, outputs in their process, which means we're able to kind of create quite a strong technology moat because we are passing through so much customer data from a variety of different manufacturers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like your point also, this again comes back to your customer focus, that they don't care how you get there. They care about solving the problem. I do a lot of pitch training, for startups, and what happens a lot, especially with companies that are founded by engineers, is it's like, here's one slide about the problem and solution. Here's 10 slides under the hood, showing all these things that we think are really cool. And then, maybe we'll remember to ask for money and tell you what we're raising for. But actually, as you say, and the analogy I use is like, think of a car commercial, right? I mean, a car has a lot of technology in it, but how often do you actually see the hood pop open in a car commercial, right? You see instead soccer balls coming out of the back seat and, families driving around because it's focused on the solution and the use case. And I think the same thing, for any startup founders out there who are preparing to raise, this is good advice. And Leise, that's probably served you well as you went to raise $1 million in February 2024 and ended up raising 2.5 million. So a pretty decent oversubscribe rate there. In the intervening year from, when we're talking now, needless to say, a lot's happened regarding, in politics domestically in the US, where you're largely based, and also sentiment kind of on climate and climate tech and, and ESG especially. I wonder, how have you experienced that change in sentiment, if at all, as someone who's leading a company like this?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And in the week of the election, I was actually down in Texas visiting a bunch of my customers in the ready-mix concrete space.
The Texan concrete space, famously blue.
Blue state, right? I can't vote in the US, but we probably wouldn't have voted the same. But what does become very clear when you get out and you actually speak with plant manager, with facility managers, is a lot of them are taking initiatives, doing different things to improve either the kind of total emission footprint or the local impact of their factories and sites, right? So most of our customers are not ivory tower climate defenders who are out talking about emissions. They're very real people who run plant operations, who have customers who are requesting materials from them. Because again, either things are getting refurbished or new construction or infrastructure is being updated. And I think a lot of our principle at Pathways is have respect for the fact that this is not going to be the number one concern for every single one of our customers or users. But it can still be a high priority. And there are ways to make it much easier to engage with. So let me come with an example from our actual product. You were talking about the environmental product declarations earlier, right? I like to say they're like the environmental nutrition facts. Instead of calories and carbohydrates, it's chemicals and carbon. And in addition to, global warming potential, there's also a range of biodiversity factors, all with kind of ample Latin names that no one outside academia knows what means, right? We've made a few very simple design choices in our product interface. So instead of eutrophication, it says algae bloom, right? That is the natural consequence of eutrophication potential of a product. But that suddenly means that someone who sits in a sales role for this kind of complex product feel comfortable speaking about it, because no one wants to feel stupid. And in my experience, most people are willing to do a bit if you don't make it too hard. So again, it's probably back to the less of the silver bullet and more of the slivers of silver, but also a fundamental belief that people do want to make positive changes. And it's certainly something we're experiencing with our customer base, when you make it much easier for them to see what are the changes they could make.
That's heartening to hear. And I mean, my approach has been to kind of bake in the impact, but, not necessarily have that at the forefront of the sales pitch. So people generally want things to be easier, cheaper, more accurate. These are the types of benefits, that people respond to. And if you can kind of pitch on the basis of that, but, underlying that is greater efficiency and climate mitigation, then that tends to resound with people pretty well. And I wonder if that's kind of the approach you're taking as well. I mean, presumably the work you're doing ultimately saves the customer a lot of money, headaches, etc.
Yeah, I mean, at the core, right, most of our customers used to have to spend, tens of hundreds of hours doing, I cannot explain how boring it is to have to go into your own SAP system to pull out data, write it down on a piece of paper, to then put it over in an Excel to then send it to a customer. It's not just boring, it's expensive, and there's a huge labor shortage, and there's not enough skilled people to do this. And then you have this booming ESG consultant group where you're just kind of pouring out money to people who also fundamentally would rather do strategy and real impact rather than measurement. I say, let's shift today our customers are spending 90% of their time. The customers and users who sit in sustainability are spending 90% of their time collecting data and 10% acting on it. I want to shift that around, spend 10% collecting. We can do all that. We can help with the scenarios. We can help model all that. And then you can spend 90% on the change management that we so urgently need.
So as we talked about, you've raised all this money last year. The company is growing. You're scaling up. What does the next kind of couple of years look like in terms of company roadmap?
Yeah, absolutely. Very exciting times for us. So I think of Pathways as building the data layer for sustainable manufacturing, right? This is a enormous, enormous market. And we've just scratched the surface of it and been able to scale really fast in that context. As many other kind of pre-seed raised venture-backed startups, we're raising based on milestones, and we're approaching those fast, and certainly imagine that we're going to be going out and looking for more people to join our mission and more people to kind of join our cap table and help us run to those next milestones. In my mind, what's kind of success been looking like in the first year, right? We went from having a pilot and no product live to now being live with 10 plus customers, scaling out to hundreds of plants. And that is incredible. But when we think about, growing to the next level, our ambition is hundreds of manufacturers, thousands of plants, and certainly also scaling outside North America, where we're already experiencing quite a lot of demand in Europe.
And you and your co-founder, Alex Cooper, both have a lot of experience working in the startup world. But for both of you, it's actually your first time in the founder's seat. And I wonder what observations you have about, this is still very fresh. It's been a very positive journey so far. What are kind of your observations on the experience of founding? What were some of the biggest surprises, for yourself? And if you can speak on behalf of Alex.
Yeah, I'll speak on behalf of Alex as well. We spent so much time together. I think the co-founder relationship is probably one of the most intimate, close relationships you can have, right? You are building something together you are so passionate about that you're both invested in. And also, it has to rely on 100% trust, right? The sensation that as I turn my head this way and look at growing with our customers, he's building and scaling our product and our engineering org, and might I say, doing an incredible job at it. So being a first-time founder, it feels a lot like playing when you were a kid. My description to my friends is like the sensation of being at the playground and coming up with a good game. And you need to get your friends along. You need to get people to believe in it. And it's all make-believe, right? So someone said, well, don't you feel imposter syndrome? And I was like, well, the very definition of a founder is you have to be the imposter, right? You get some customers to believe in something that doesn't quite exist yet. you get brilliant engineers to go along and build the thing you've just kind of like amorphously described, and investors to back that with the big roadmap. And I think being comfortable sitting in that space of kind of imagining is something that very few roles I've had previously required of me. And it's a different space to sit in.
It makes me think of Yuval Noah Harari in Sapiens talking about all these things that we hold as given that are all fictions, like money, companies. All these things are fictions that only work if other people believe in them, right? So I mean, and that's as you talked about the imposter syndrome and and being a founder. I mean, it really seems to fit in that framework.
Yeah, and then it does become real, right?
Yeah,
That's the and I love this. I mean, Harari's concept of the story is at the core. But then now a year after we raised our pre-seed, we have a product that is ingesting real data, generating real emission footprints, allowing our customers to figure out where can they improve and ultimately also drive more sales based on sustainability. So this idea of kind of constantly coming up with the next story and the journey and the huge scale of the potential for what we're building.
Yeah, I mean, again, coming back to some of the pitch training and work that I do and accelerator work, everything is about, creating a story, making sure that all the important facts that need to be there are somehow inserted along the way. But, a 10-slide PowerPoint with 8 numbers on each one is going to get you nowhere. So it's about telling the story of like, why are you the right person to do this? Why is this important to you? What's your vision for this? And then along the way, sprinkling in kind of the important facts about market and customer and that type of thing along the way.
Yeah, and I mean, I always say, for me, it's all about our customers. They're the ones who are making the real impact here. And how do you put them at the center of the changes they can make in their own companies, right? And I mean, I'll be forever grateful to some of our really early customers who took bets on us and kind of rolling out and testing what pathways could be, but ultimately in service of a mission they're on and a story they're telling inside their organizations about why should we do this with technology, with AI, instead of in kind of a more traditional manual way.
Some of the advice I give to founders is that when you're talking with investors, you can never talk too much about your customer. There's no such thing, right? I mean, there's absolutely no, it's music to our ears as investors to hear that you're completely focused on your customers.
Well, I'm almost obsessive, so that might it might tend to overdone, but
I don't think so.
Catch me on a steel plant with a hard hat, and I'll be hard pressed to leave.
One thing you posted on your LinkedIn, which I love, is you say that planet and climate is what keeps you up at night, and that you live your life in pursuit of a single planet society. And it's the first time I've ever heard someone say that. And I think it bears calling out specifically now in this like Musk-dominated endless news cycle that we seem to be in. For this, we're living in tough times to be optimistic about some of this stuff. And I wonder, what advice do you have to listeners who also kind of stay awake at night worrying about this stuff and our only planet?
Well, I think first of all, believing in the single planet gets me into a lot of trouble. Again, sometimes when I'm down in Texas visiting customers, we certainly have different perspectives on that. But at the core, I think we have a wonderful planet here, and I want to dedicate my life to making sure it's accessible and available, not just to humans, but to animals, to our kind of wide range of biodiversity for many, many hundreds of generations to come. The anxiety that I have good friends who feel, family who feel, is very real. And I mean, I think we all deal with that differently. I have a bias to action. It's probably why I ended up being a founder in the first place. And for me, there's nothing that gives me more hope than the sensation of doing my part. But that can look really differently, right? Part of my job also includes that I fly much more than I would like to. And it gives me a lot of guilt. But ultimately, that's part of being able to kind of build what I do, and I certainly justify it for myself. And simultaneously, you see people who handle and deal with that differently and see communities around how to do it. But for me, personally, there's nothing more fulfilling than trying to do my part.
I think that's a great place to leave it, and very good advice for people out there that, I think the bias towards action is also a really good point. Leise, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Such a pleasure. Have a lovely day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to another Climate Tech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.